As the global security and economic landscape continues to shift, Canada is preparing for a high stakes week on the international stage. Prime Minister Mark Carney will head to Brussels on Sunday to meet with European leaders. Carney will then head to The Hague in the Netherlands for the NATO summit on Tuesday and Wednesday. The trip is seen as both a diplomatic engagement and a signal of Canada's deepening involvement in transatlantic affairs. Joining me now is Kerry, former Canadian ambassador to NATO, for her perspective on what's at stake and what Canadians should be watching for. Ambassador Buck, thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure.
Now, these upcoming NATO and Canada EU summits come at a pretty tense moment globally. What are key issues that Canadians or that Canada should address in these meetings?
Well, Canada knows that it has to diversify its trade and defense relationships with an increasingly unpredictable American president and with the threats of tariffs and with the new threat environment beyond tariffs of not just Russia acting more aggressively, but China and other threats. So we have to do more and we have to diversify. So the first stop for Prime Minister Carney at the EU in Brussels, he will very likely conclude a new security and defense
Mhm.
agreement with the EU, and that opens the door to a program that's called Rearm Europe. And in a nutshell, it is allowing European states to pool military procurement and really ramp up their military capabilities. They need to do that. They need to do it for NATO. They need to do it for the new security environment. And that agreement would allow Canada and Canadian defense industries to enter the European market and Canada to pool procurement with European states. It should be win-win for Europe and for Canada.
Now, there's been renewed attention on NATO defense spending. Canada has faced criticism in the past for not meeting the 2% target. Is that likely going to become a sticking point?
No, because Prime Minister Carney announced June 9th that Canada will meet the 2% NATO target this year, 5 years earlier than the previous government had announced. That's good news. That puts NATO in a very good position. NATO Sec Gen Mark Rutte announced a couple of days ago that all NATO allies will be meeting the 2% this year. So that's great. And it was tactically very smart for the Prime Minister of Canada to announce this last week. It won't be a sticking point. The how much Canada spends on defense at the NATO summit, but what will be a challenge for everyone at the table is a decision I expect to be made at the NATO summit next week to increase the target for defense spending for all allies to between 3 and 3.5% of GDP, with an additional 1.5% of GDP to be spent on what they're calling defense enablers. That's things like roads, ports, airways, cyber resilience, et cetera. Things that aren't technically and completely within a defense envelope, but nonetheless help bolster security. And that'll be the main menu item for the NATO meeting next week.
Now, Mark Rutte, as you mentioned, said that he does want to change the defense spending target. Do you think the target that he's setting is a realistic target that is something obtainable?
Current plans, regional defense plans that have been set by Supreme Allied Commander Europe. What that is, that's the top general that advises NATO. It's Eisenhower's old job. Current plans would require roughly 3.7% of GDP
Mhm.
across all allies to meet current defense plans right now. And we know that the main adversary in Europe, at least Russia, is ramping up even more. SecGen of NATO said that Russia would be in a position to attack NATO within the next 5 years. So if the NATO summit next week agrees to 3.5% of GDP on defense, it will not be enough to meet the current defense plans, and it certainly won't be enough to meet defense plans that will have to shift to make NATO more resilient to deter any future threat by Russia.
Well, as you mentioned, the prime minister has said that Canada will meet the 2% threshold this year, but do we have any insight on what exactly that money will be used for?
Yeah, there was an announcement out by the government about the various funding envelopes, the what we call the supplementary estimates, which they were tabled the same day, and so they parsed out what the money would be spent on. A lot of it would be spent on personnel because there's a
Mhm.
personnel gap. Of course, you need money, you need people inside to deliver, including to procure goods. A lot on Arctic and a number of other headings. So we know what that current money is going to be spent on right away. Um, the current defense policy suite outlines a number of plans for Canadian capabilities, military capabilities over the next few years. But the Prime Minister also promised a new defense policy that will come out in his speech on June 9th. So watch that space.
And what would a successful summit look like from Canada's perspective?
A successful summit would be one where there's no visible public rift between the United States and other allies on any issue at all. It'll be a very slimmed down summit. It will focus mostly, at least the leaders' discussion will focus mostly on defense spending. There'll also be a few other states in attendance. Remains to be seen exactly how that's going to work out. There will be states from the Indo-Pacific who will be in attendance because there's a new and rising threat from China, global threat from China. So I expect Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, some or all of those to be there. And then President Zelensky was also
Mhm.
invited. Again, there's no formal leaders meeting dedicated to either Ukraine or to the Indo Pacific, but there will be interactions between NATO allies and those leaders, and that'll broaden the discussion, but the main decisions around defense spending.
And given your time as Canada's ambassador to NATO, how has the alliance evolved since then? And what's the sense for its future direction?
Well, the alliance has gone through a few phases, and I
Mhm.
won't head into a long history lesson. Um, but the phase we've been in since about 2014 is a period where NATO had to really focus again on deterrence and defense of NATO territories. The threat hadn't been that big, but when Vladimir Putin, for the first time, invaded Crimea in Ukraine, that was the first time that borders in Europe had been crossed like that since the Second World War. So NATO really focused more on building up its deterrence and defense, primarily along the eastern flank where Russia is. But it's also had to adjust to a whole bunch of new threats,
Mhm.
cyber, space, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where NATO's been heading. But the big elephant in the room is whether and how the US will continue to participate in NATO. And NATO relies on a mutual defense guarantee. It's all for one and one for all. If there's an attack on one ally, the rest of the alliance is meant to step in. And that, from pronouncements from President Trump, that's in shaky ground. And that's a very worrisome development. And all other NATO allies have to step up, spend more on defense because it's in our own interest, but also try and keep the US in the alliance for as long and as deep as possible.
Well, and on that, what do you make of NATO's role in the conflict that's unfolding between Israel and Iran? President Trump has weighed in that the US might get involved. But as you kind of mentioned, NATO would become liable or they would have to join if the United States continues to choose to be a part of NATO. So, what would happen in that situation?
Well, the Article 5 mutual defense guarantee. So, if one of our allies gets attacked, the other will, wouldn't
Mhm.
apply in that situation, right?
Okay.
It's so there's actually no role for NATO in the Israel-Iran climate. NATO has in the past, when coalitions of the willing have been formed in places like Libya and then Afghanistan, for instance, they have transitioned into larger NATO missions for sure. That has happened in the past. We're nowhere near that calculus on Israel Iran right now. Right now, it's Israel alone prosecuting what they're prosecuting. And So that's a conversation for another day, and it's a conversation that may never happen. For sure, the leaders, when they meet in Brussels next week, will be talking about the Iran-Israel conflict, for sure, and they'll be talking about it in their bilateral meetings. But it's not now a NATO thing, and may never, will likely never be a NATO thing.
Now, we do have about a minute left in this interview, but you've mentioned in an op ed piece for Policy Magazine that Canada can help shape the future of NATO. Why is that?
Well, it's in our interest to do it. We are the country that makes the transatlantic alliance transatlantic. The US does too, but with shaky US pronouncements about their interest in NATO right now, we've got a job to do. So we can do a few things. We can make sure that the transatlantic relationship is alive and well by working more closely with European allies, including the EU, but also other Arctic states like Norway that's not in the EU. Arctic is really important to us. All Arctic states except Russia are in NATO now. We have a lot to do on the Arctic in NATO. That's very important. I think it will be also important as we beef up our own defense of Canada that two things happen. We continue to contribute to European stability. It's in our direct interest, our direct economic and security interest, but at the same time that we make sure that NATO recognizes our contributions in North America, in Canada, to our own defense as contributions to NATO. Um, our defense spending as a percentage of GDP is measured in NATO terms. But when NATO goes to give us all jobs to do, saying, okay, you need to have 15 planes at the ready to do XYZ, for example, um, the planning is about what is needed for the European theater. And we should be making the argument that North America and the Canadian territory is a job for NATO too. And that's a job that we take care of, and they should take into account what we contribute to our own territory. I'd love to see a more nuanced discussion around defense spending. Percentage of GDP doesn't really measure impacts at all. It's a very crude measurement. It's carried a lot of political weight. So it would be very interesting to have a conversation that retools that metric to focus on impact. But that's will be more of interest to NATO nerds. And it would take a long time to turn that ship around because that idea of measuring defense as percentage of GDP has been there for a long time. It's gained a political weight. But the whole point is about what NATO allies can actually achieve in response to threats that are facing all of our citizenry. So that's an important thing to do. I guess the last thing, and this isn't at NATO necessarily, but it'd be really important to talk to Canadians so they understand what the threat is that's actually facing Canadians and what it isn't, and why we need to invest more. We've underinvested for decades in our people and in our military, and I'd say in our diplomacy too. And that has to change.
Well, Ambassador Buck, thank you for the time today.
Thanks very much.